we're going to be using ASP.NET Core MVC, which renders UI on the server, uses a model view controller architectural pattern. MVC pattern separates an app into three main groups of components: models, views, and controllers. So user requests are routed to a controller. Controller is responsible for working with the model to perform user actions or retrieve results of queries. Queries meaning queries to the database, in this case a relational database. And then the controller chooses the view to display to the user and provides it with any model data it requires. So the benefits of using an MVC ASP.NET Core is that based on a scalable and mature model for building large web apps, so you could use this to, like, sky's the limit, you can build whatever you want. Clear separation of concerns with the MVC architecture, so that creates maximum flexibility. And it's a separation of responsibilities that ensures that the business model can evolve without being tightly coupled to low-level implementation details. So anyway, if you want to get started with it, they've got this tutorial. And let's go ahead and jump over there. So at the end of the series, you'll have an app that manages and displays movie data. You'll learn how to create a web app, add and scaffold a model, work with the database, add search and validation. And so you can go straight to the sample code and you can download it and look at that if you want. I find that it can be really helpful to go to a repository and look through the solution. So in this case, 8.0 completed is what you would want. And like, this is it. This is the app. And so you can see that they have their program.cs. You'd have to do some digging to learn this, but program.cs is like the main file that kind of brings everything together for the routing and hooks up all the models and controllers and everything. And if you go back, they separate everything into their own folders. So you have your controllers folder, your models folder, your views folder, and then you have migrations, which is for your database, just so you can keep track of all the changes to the database and as you create your models. And then they have this www root, which has your client-side static files, your CSS, JavaScript, and then they have a lib for if you have a specific library like Bootstrap, jQuery, etc. So really well organized. And if you're coming from any other MVC type framework, even if it's an MVT framework like Django, then you're probably used to this level of organization. Something like Laravel or Ruby on Rails, they're all going to have this type of structure. And so it's really easy, even though like I don't know anything about C#, period. Just don't use it, don't know anything about it. But it should make it really easy to come in and develop using a web framework that abstracts all that stuff away from you, so you can just focus on, okay, this is MVC, same architecture, and yeah, you're going to have to use a little bit of C# to build stuff, but truly you're just connecting to a model, making requests to some relational or non-relational database, getting that data, and then putting it on a page. So there's obviously more that can happen there, but that's the basics. So let's go back to the actual tutorial. It's in here for a second, so cool. All right, so prerequisites. You can use Visual Studio, which is a code editor from Microsoft. Visual Studio Code is a little more flexible in terms of working with like other languages. So that's what most of us use, Visual Studio Code. Or if you're on Mac, ASP.NET is cross-platform from the looks of it, and so you can use Visual Studio for Mac. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, which is just the code editor. And if you have Visual Studio Code or a fork of it like Codium or VS Codium, I think it's called, which is like an open source version of it, or something like Cursor, then it should work just fine as long as you have access to the marketplace so you can get certain extensions. And so you want to be familiar with VS Code. I assume most of you are. And so the other thing that we need is C# for Visual Studio Code. So if you click on this link, you literally just click install, and then it'll take you into your editor. You can actually go over to your extensions, and I already have it here, C# and C# dev kit. They don't say you need dev kit, but I went ahead and got it. Visual Studio Code noticed that I got C# and it was like, hey, you probably want this other thing too. It is official from Microsoft, and it just gives you a bunch of extra stuff. So apparently I need to restart to get access to those. In any event, I got those, So you'll want to get those installed if you're trying to follow along. We're going to move pretty quickly, so don't feel like you have to follow along. You'll probably benefit more from just watching me and listening than trying to follow along simultaneously. Later, if you're watching this live, then you probably don't want to follow along. If you're watching it as a recording on YouTube, then of course you can just pause it, come back, and make the changes as we move through the tutorial. So the other thing is you want the .NET 8.0 SDK. So this takes you to another area of Microsoft, another subdomain, .NETmicrosoft.com, and you can just download it and install it. So if you're on Linux, Mac, or Windows, you just choose which one. Then you probably don't want to install from binaries unless you know what you're doing. So you just pick one of these installers here, and then they have package manager instructions for Linux if you're a Linux person. But for Windows, you just figure out, okay, am I on a 64-bit, 32-bit? Am I using ARM? Or do I just want to do it with WinGet? So I just did x64, download, install it. It was easy. I could be wrong. This might even come with, like, if you're using Windows 10, Windows 11, it might even be a part of like your Windows update or whatever. So you might already have it. But anyway, these are the prerequisites for the tutorial. Once you have the code editor, the extension, and the SDK installed, then you're ready to go. So we're going to do it all from scratch. Let's go over here to our code editor, and we do need to create a folder, so let's do that. Let me get this out of our way real quick. All right, so I'm going to go over to code. Hopefully, I guess maybe I don't have Z on here. Do I? All right, it's throwing a fit. All right, where are we? So we're going to CD into documents, and then probably DevSprout, and then probably code. And then I think I probably already have a .NET. Yeah, net MVC, and then MVC movie. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove everything inside of here and get rid of that. Okay. So within your terminal, it doesn't have to be the terminal inside VS Code, but if you're using VS Code, it makes sense to do that. I'm using a bash terminal. You could very well do this whole thing with, what's the one that everybody uses? PowerShell if you're a Windows user. Or you could even use the command prompt if you're old school. No big deal. So the command that we want here is that first we want to select the new terminal, and then we want to change to the directory that will contain the project. So I'm inside of mine. It's just called net MVC. And then we're going to run some commands. So the command, there's a CLI tool called .NET that I assume came with the SDK that we installed. And it has a new command, MVC. So that's just like an option, and then -O, and then the name of the app. And then you just want to open the project in your code editor such that it's like the main workspace. So if you just copy this whole thing, you can paste it in here, and it's going to run the first command. So all that did, .NET new MVC -O MVC movie, and then it just tells you, hey, this is a template, ASP.NET Core web app model view controller successfully created. Contains technologies from parties other than Microsoft, so just some blah blah stuff. And then it's just saying, hey, now with code -R MVC movie, which is the folder that's right in front of us. So if we just do an ls, or if you're on command prompt, you can do a dir, and you'll see, okay, MVC movie is in the directory that we're inside of. So now we actually want to open it up. And man, I don't know why my terminal is being so unresponsive, but so code R MVC movie, and it's just going to restart VS Code, but now you can see MVC movie is the main folder that we're looking at inside of our editor. And then you'll notice, because we installed that C# extension, it already takes us over here to this output over here. We have our terminal, so we can run our terminal commands, but the thing about it is the C# is a compiled language. So we have to build the app like every time we want to run it, so that we have access now to these tools within VS Code, or if you're using Visual Studio, it's built in such that you can install or build the application, and then it'll run it it'll run the server, and we can view it in the browser. So currently we don't need to do anything. We have access to all these files and folders are default. They come with whatchamacallit, they come with .NET MVC. So cool, we've got the structure in place. Now we can actually start getting familiar with like how the routing works and how we can create templates and how we can actually view those templates in the browser. So let's get back over to the tutorial and view that. All right, so it does a little breakdown here. Hey, the .NET new command creates a new ASP.NET Core MVC project in the MVC movie folder. Simple as that. Code command opens the MVC movie project in the current instance of Visual Studio Code. So that's where we are currently. Visual Studio Code might display a dialog box that asks, do you trust the authors of the files in this folder? So for me, I already told it yes. If you see that for the first time, you just tell it that you trust it. So you want to click yes, trust the authors and all files in the parent folder. So selecting yes, and then the next step, when Visual Studio Code requests that you add assets to build and debug the project, also select yes. If Visual Studio Code doesn't offer to add, build, and debug assets, then go ahead and click on View, Command Palette, or just Control-Shift-P if you're on Windows, and then type in .NET, and then go to the .NET Generate Assets for build and debug command. So what that looks like, Control-Shift-P, you just type .NET, it gives you all these different commands. The one we want is right here in the center. Generate assets for build and debug, you just click on that. And what we're going to get is this hidden VS Code folder with this launch JSON and task JSON inside of it. And I think that is what's going to allow us to very easily build the project within VS Code. So then the next step is to run the app. So trust the HTTPS development certificate by running the following command. So you're just going to copy this and put it into your terminal. .NET dev search HTTPS -- trust, and it's just saying, hey, we trust this. So I believe that you can run a HTTPS server, so a secure server, locally right out of the gate simply by trusting the certificate that they generate for you, which is great. You don't normally get to do that in a lot of other frameworks without quite a bit of configuration. And so just having that right out of the gate is really nice. You will see, however, that the browser that we use to view the application, some browsers won't work with it automatically. And so there's some additional configuration if you have a preferred browser, but I think with Chrome, we can get it to work like pretty easily. All right, so it says that the preceding command doesn't work on Linux. See your Linux distribution's documentation for trusting a certificate. So if you're on Linux and you're trying to develop ASP.NET, like most things with Linux, you're gonna have to do quite a bit of configuration, but it's all good. So the preceding command displays the following dialog, provided the certificate was not previously trusted. We didn't see this dialog here because I did previously trust it. So then you would select yes if you agree to trust the development certificate, and you can read more about that there. So there's also, if you want to use Firefox and you're getting an error when you still try and go view the working application, then they have a different area of the documentation that allows you to work through that. You might even be able to utilize that same information for a different browser. I don't know. I haven't tried it. It's just I couldn't get it to work with Edge, and I didn't bother to look into it any further, so I just switched over to Google Chrome. So next step, this is the fun part. In Visual Studio Code, we can do a Control F5 on Windows, or I think that's like Option or something, F5 on Mac, to run the app without debugging. And so Visual Studio Code starts something called Kestrel, launches a browser, and navigates to whatever port gets assigned for the localhost. The address bar shows localhost plus whatever dynamic port, and not something like example.com. So the standard host name for your local computer is localhost. It's mapped to an IP 127.0.0.0.1. Localhost only serves web requests from the local computer. So most of you are probably familiar with this sort of thing if you've developed with like Node.js, Express.js, Ruby on Rails, whatever. You just do like localhost 3000 or 8000 or 8001 or whatever. This is the same thing. All right, so basically launching the app without debugging by selecting Control F5 allows you to make code changes, save the file, and quickly refresh the browser to see the code changes. So while we don't have a hot reload on the browser, at least not currently configured, we are able to make changes, refresh, and see them. So then you can close the browser, and from the run menu, you can stop debugging, or you can press Shift F5 as opposed to Control F5, and it'll stop the app. Let's see if we can get that to work. So let's do Control F5. And so right away, it's running this new terminal instance where it's building it. And you can see it's building the application here. Go ahead and make this full screen. And, oh, nice. This is working in Edge now. Wasn't working last time. Right on. So here we are. We've got our default boilerplate web application up and running on localhost. You'll notice it's on HTTPS instead of HTTP, and then they just gave us a port 7132. So we've got our little title here. We've got our home link, which is where we are. We've got a different page, privacy, which just really simple. It just has some text. There's a footer. Click on privacy, it takes you to the same place. And home takes us back to home. And then this link here is probably to the documentation. Awesome. We have a working web application, and all we had to do was install an SDK. And because we're using Visual Studio Code, we had to install an extension, and that was it. We ran a couple commands with the CLI tool from the SDK, got an application scaffolded for us, and we were able to run it with a simple command after we hooked up the build and debug portion of .NET with Visual Studio Code. Create that .vs Code folder for us with some config files inside of it, allowed us to run the Control F5 command, and then here we are with our working application. Pretty sweet. Let's continue. All right, so the next step is that we want to add a controller. So part 2, add a controller to your ASP.NET Core MVC app. Which, by the way, it's a little mind-blowing that we're already this far. Like most MVC frameworks, while they are fairly easy to use, the setup for them can take a little while. Getting all of the things that you needed installed to get an application up and running. It just depends on what your environment is. Like if you're on Windows, you're using, in this case, ASP.NET, it's going to play pretty nice. If you're on a Mac and you try to do something like Laravel, it's probably going to work really easily. Same thing for Ruby on Rails on Mac. They play pretty nicely. Ruby on Rails does work on Windows, Laravel does too, but in some instances, depending on how familiar you are with setting things up, it can be a little tricky. Obviously, there's a bunch of others. I find that Django works really good cross-platform, so that's another one. But all right, so let's get into it. The Model View Controller MVC architectural pattern separates an app into 3 main components: the model, the view, and the controller. The MVC pattern helps you create apps that are more testable and easier to update than traditional monolithic apps. MVC-based apps contain models, so these are classes that represent the data of the app. The model classes use validation logic to enforce business rules for that data. Typically, model objects retrieve and store model state in a database. In this tutorial, a movie, notice that movie is spelled with a capital M, just being indicative of both a model and a class, which are in this case kind of the same thing. The movie model retrieves movie data from a database, provides it to the view, or updates it. Updated data is written to a database. Views are the components that display the app's user interface, UI. Generally, this UI displays the model data. Controllers. These are classes that handle browser requests, retrieve model data, and call view templates that return a response. So in an MVC app, the view only displays information. The controller is what handles and responds to user input and interaction. So for example, the controller handles URL segments and query string values and passes these values to the model. The model might use these values to query the database. For example, if we go down here and we take a look, a request to HTTPS localhost 5001/home/privacy specifies the home controller and the privacy action. So this particular format is kind of a RESTful format, kind of not, as kind of specific to .NET MVC, but also you might see it, at least something similar to it in other MVC frameworks. But essentially, the first parameter is indicative of the controller, and then the second parameter is mapped to the action, or if you're coming from another language, the function or the method of that controller. And so on this one, we have 3 different parameters: movies, edit, 5. So movies would be the controller, edit would be the action, and then 5 here is going to be a ID parameter that helps us identify a specific resource, movie resource, that needs to be edited in this case. So route data is explained later in this tutorial, so we don't have to worry too much about that. So the MVC architectural pattern separates an app into three main groups of components: your models, views, and controllers. Man, they're really hitting the hammer on the head here. So this pattern helps to achieve separation of concerns. The UI logic belongs in the view. Sorry, I had to silence my phone. Input logic belongs in the controller. Business logic belongs in the model. This separation helps manage complexity when building an app because it enables work on one aspect of the implementation at a time without impacting the code of another. For example, you can work on the view code without depending on the business logic code. These concepts are introduced and demonstrated in this tutorial series while building a movie app. The MVC project contains folders for the controllers and views. All right, so we're going to go back to Visual Studio Code here. Select the Explorer icon, then control-click, right-click on controllers. Create a new file and name the new file hello world controller.cs. So CS is going to be C#. So someone asked the question, do we need to hit refresh on the browser, or is it automatically going to show new changes when we switch to the browser? The tutorial said that we have to refresh. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I don't think there's a hot reload enabled. You might be able to install something or configure something that allows that, but for now, I would say it's safe to bet on needing to refresh anytime you make changes. So you change your code, you go back to the browser, you refresh. Sometimes with certain frameworks, the change of like business logic in a model, for instance, will require a refresh, whereas a change to a view, like a template, will not. I don't know if that's the case here, but we'll find out. All right, so basically what they're saying is, hey, go to controllers, right-click, and create a new file, or use this icon right here, new file, or just if you're familiar with the terminal, you can navigate that way. But one way or another, we want to create a new controller, just for the sake of getting familiar with this paradigm. So we have this hello world controller.cs. I believe CS is just the C# file extension. And you can see the little C# icon over here. All right, cool. So then they say, go ahead and replace the contents, which is nothing at this point, with the following code. So we're going to go ahead and copy the code from this snippet right here with this copy link, and then we'll bring it over here and we'll paste it in. Save that file. All right, so every public method in a controller is callable as an HTTP endpoint. In the sample above, both methods return a string. Note the comments preceding each method. An HTTP endpoint is a targetable URL in the web application, such as https localhost 5001/hello world. Combines the protocol, so HTTPS in this case, or HTTP if you don't have the TLS set up, and then the network location of the web server, including the TCP port. So you have your domain here, localhost, and then you have your port, in this case 5001. To target your URI, and so this portion of the URL is going to be our hello world, which is a single parameter indicative of the hello world controller. Now, to go a step further, we'll read the comments here in a second, or we'll read the thing, but let's just go ahead and look at the actual code that they gave us. So I'll zoom in so you can see a little better. All right. So at the top, we have this thing using. They haven't told us anything about this stuff. Namespace, using, we don't know anything about it yet, unless you're familiar with C# or you're familiar with ASP.NET. But we can just assume that if it says using something, it's probably a library, which has a class that is exported, or when I say library, it could also be a module that is somewhere else, and we're bringing it in, and then we can make use of some methods or functions that are available through this class. And then this namespace, MVC movie controllers, in most cases, namespaces are a way of removing the potential conflicts in the namespace. So like, for example, if you had a method here, in this case index, and then you had another method somewhere else also index, this one is specific to the hello world controller versus one that might be specific to a different controller. And so this particular namespace is the MVC movie controllers namespace. And then within it, we've got our hello world controller. So we have our public class. So this is just saying, hey, we have this class, it's not private, and this colon controller. And so if you mouse over it, you can see that controller is a class that comes from Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC, which sure enough, that's what we have up here. So we get access to controller because we brought this module in up top. And so it's a base class for an MVC controller with view support. I don't know C#, but man, it sure looks to me like we defined our custom class here, and this colon is saying, hey, inherit everything from this controller class. So now suddenly our Hello World class, which is just a basic class with nothing special about it, has a bunch of stuff that it can do that it inherited from the controller class. All right, cool. So then inside of here, we're going to start defining what look like some methods. So methods are just functions on a class. And this one, the first one, is called index. Now it says public string index. Typically when you see a data type like this, you know that it's a way of saying that this function returns a string. And sure enough, look at what we're doing here. We're returning a string. A string is something that's inside of single quotes or double quotes or sometimes backticks. All right, cool. So even though we don't know C#, at least I don't know it, it's pretty darn easy to read this stuff and see what's going on here. And this is what I love about web frameworks, is they make it pretty easy to get started with minimal knowledge. And so this is saying, hey, because you have a method called index, it's mapped to a URL / hello world. So it's the same as the controller minus the controller part. And it doesn't need a / index to indicate the method. So that tells us that if you have a method named index, that is the main endpoint for that controller's parameters, so hello world. However, if it's anything other than index, like welcome for instance, then you have to say / method name. In this case, the method public string welcome is capital W welcome. This also returns a string. Okay, cool. So it's, from the looks of it, there's some code behind the scenes for routing that's looking at our file structure and going into the files and looking at the class that's there that it inherits from controller, making it a controller class, has some methods, and it's mapping these methods from this controller class to these URL endpoints so that the routing will work when someone sends a request in the browser to one of these endpoints. That's where we are so far. And so let's confirm that here. Basically, the first comment states that this is a get method that is invoked by appending hello world to the base URL. The base URL being this thing that we just talked about, localhost 5001. The second comment specifies that a get method that is invoked by appending hello world / welcome to the URL. So later on in the tutorial, the scaffolding engine is used to generate post methods which update data. So they've got this thing they're calling a scaffolding engine. Sounds like because it's a batteries included framework, you can literally just run some CLI commands, command line interface commands, and get a bunch of functionality just like written for you, save you some time. So we'll see that whenever we get to it. So to run the app without the debugger, of course, Control F5 Windows, Command F5 Mac, and then we're going to append / hello world to the path in the address bar. Now they like to use this, in this case it's a, I forget what they call it. It's like, it's not camel case because it starts with a capital letter, so maybe it's title case or something like that. But anyway, it's this capital letter for the first character in every word in this multi-word parameter. So we're going to append hello world to the path in the address bar, and the index method returns a string. So we should get back in our browser. This is my default action. All right, so let's go over here, and we haven't restarted our server yet. So first, when we go over here and we say hello world, nothing happens. However, this little thing up here is controlling our server. If we just click the little green arrow, we should be able, or Control Shift F5 if you want to get down on some shortcuts, it should restart it. And so it's actually probably going to, when this is done running, it's probably going to open up a brand new window. Which can be kind of annoying. I wish it would just refresh the existing one. So like, here's our original one. We can close that now. It opened up a new one for us. So now if we add hello world, it just returns a string. And I think I have some type of nighttime thing enabled here. So it's probably a white background with black text, but maybe not. Maybe this is how it works by default. Anyway, there's our string. This is my default action. Now, notice if we say index here, it does the same thing. So that's just to prove the point that if you have a method, a public method called index inside of a controller class, then you don't have to put / index. That's your default root route for that controller. So you just include the controller name, in this case hello world without controller at the end, and it's going to default to the thing that we saw. Now the tutorial is probably going to tell us to go to welcome next, adding this additional parameter. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and sure enough the text changed. This is the welcome action method. Okay, so if we go back over here, we scroll down, it says MVC invokes controller classes and the action methods within them depending on the incoming URL. The default URL routing logic used by MVC uses a format like this to determine what code to invoke. So you can see / bracket controller / bracket action name / bracket parameters. Apparently my internet connection is unstable, so if y'all lose me, I'm so sorry. Okay, so the routing format is set in the program.cs file. That's that file we looked at the very beginning. But you can see here they have this code app.map controller route name default. So this is a method that's being called, and then pattern, and you can see it's a string where controller is set equal to home by default, and then / action is set equal to index by default. That's why if you omit it, it'll default. Which, by the way, if you just go to / the default controller is going to be home, and then / ID with a question mark, meaning it's optional, but if it is there, it's going to set the third parameter to a key of ID. So when you browse to the app and you don't supply any URL segments, it defaults to the home controller and the index method specified in the template line highlighted above in the preceding URL segments. So basically that's just saying what we just said here. If we just go to the home page, even though we don't see anything up top, it's taking us to /home / index. So if we go look at our code here, we open up our file system here, inside of controllers directory, we have that default home controller that came with the app when we scaffolded it. So if we go look over here, we can see, sure enough, it's got a lot of stuff, but it does have a public method that returns a view. We haven't gotten that far yet, so we don't really know what a view is, but it has one called index, and it's not returning a string, it's returning this thing called IA or IAction result. We'll learn more about that in a little bit. But just know that it does have this index, and it has another one called privacy, and that's why when you go to privacy, notice home, that's the controller, privacy. So now we're getting more familiar with this URL structure for the routing. All right, cool. So it's just telling us to do what we did. So now, if you modify the code to pass some parameter information from the URL to the controller, for example, you have your hello world and you have welcome, and then you add a question mark, which is the way with all browsers that you add a query string, and you add some query string parameters here. One is name equals Rick, and then you separate the next one with an ampersand, num times equal to 4. Nothing's going to happen at first. So what we would do is we would write some code that would pull in parameters, query string parameters rather, from the URL, and we'd be able to extract the values that are assigned to those and output them. And of course, that's one way with a GET request specifically that you're able to extract information from a URL in your web applications and use it to do things like sort, search, filter through data, and then return data in some way. So this is our hello world welcome. We can go ahead and copy this code, and we can go back over here. We'll go out of our home controller. We're back in our MVC hello world controller, and we go down to welcome. And then I don't know if we got a comment in there. We did. So we're going to go ahead and take all these lines right here and replace them. And we lost our formatting, so let's see if we can get that back. It doesn't give us our original formatting. It gives us different formatting. So let's just format it ourselves for now. All right, cool. So here it's saying, hey, this is a GET request, hello world welcome, requires using system text encodings web. So if you look, we're already using it up top here. And by the way, before we had this in here, this new code, this was grayed out. So this is Visual Studio Code saying, hey, yeah, you imported this module, the web module, but you're not actually using it. And then the moment we use it, the code editor is smart enough to, now this is no longer grayed out, or the transparency of it was increased, or whatever you want to call it. Now it identifies that it's being used. Okay. So we got this HTML encoder, and we use this default encode, and we pass in this $ double curly brackets. This is like looks to me like a template literal sort of syntax, allows us to inject variables into what would otherwise be a string. And so you'll notice that we added some things inside the parentheses here. String name, comma, int num times equals 1. So what this means is that name is expected to be a string, and num times is expected to be an integer or a number. And if no num times is provided, then it defaults to 1. So now if we go to /welcome, hello world welcome, and we pass in a name parameter as a query string and num times query string parameter, then we're going to extract those and we're going to show them to the user as output. So now that we saved, we're going to go ahead and refresh the browser, or refresh the server rather, which will give us a new browser window. And then we're going to head over to /hello world/welcome. And again, we're going to use the question mark here to add the query string parameters. And we're going to say name is equal to, you can put anything here. The guy that wrote the tutorial's name is Rick, so he had Rick. And then we need to separate the next one. Well, let's see what happens when we don't include it at all, because if you recall, the num times had the equal 1 thing. So it's like, hey, if you don't provide a num times, it's just going to default to 1. So let's see what happens there. So if we submit it, hello Rick, num times is 1. Now if you want to change num times, you throw the ampersand in there, the and sign, and you say num times, all lowercase, is equal to, and then you set it to whatever the heck you want. So if we want it to be 543, when we press enter, that value gets pulled from the URL and displayed back to the user inside of this string. Nice. All right, cool. So that's pretty neat. This has a little breakdown of everything. Question mark is for our query string, and then we've got our name and num times parameters, and you separate them with the ampersand, so everything we talked about here. What's on the left of the equal sign is the key, and then the right side is the value. You have these little combination of key value pairs that then allow us to extract the values from the keys. So we're going to replace the welcome method with the following code, and this is going to make things a little bit different. So when you go back to our file, and here's our welcome method, go ahead and paste this in, fix our formatting. Oops, lost one of our curly brackets. I think if I update, I don't know what my spacing is, I'm not going to worry about it right now, but clearly mine is set to 2 and theirs is 4. So anyway, you'll notice it changed now. This time we have string name, comma, int, but we're no longer doing num times. We have this ID equals 1 thing. So then they updated this template literal here, or whatever they call it in C#, this string with these dynamically injected variables. And so we have name, and now we have ID. And so we'll restart our server, and we'll go, in the meantime, go see what they want us to do. So what they want us to do is we want to run the app, and then we want to enter the following URL. That is hello world welcome 3 as a parameter, not a query string parameter, but just as a URL parameter, and then add a query string with the name Rick. So we'll do it 2 ways, and we'll see how they work. So let's close this one. We're back here. Now if we get rid of the num times thing, because we no longer are looking for a num times, and we just say hello world welcome name Rick, and we do an enter, ID defaults to 1. Remember, we had ID equals 1. But if after welcome we do a / and we add a third parameter, so the first one is hello world is the controller name, the second one welcome is the what they're calling the action name, and then the third one is going to be this ID parameter. So we just say something like 3, and then the query string doesn't need a /. Technically you could include it, but that's not proper syntax. So you can do query string with the question mark and then your key value pair, or multiple key value pairs if you have multiple query strings. And we press enter, and now ID has been updated, get all this junk out of my way, to 3 based on this parameter. It's not a query string parameter, it's just a URL parameter. Okay, so that's pretty cool. It looks like the way that they write their code, they group them together. So while name is a query string parameter and ID is a URL parameter, it's still just making them arguments inside of the welcome action. And I do wonder what happens if we switch them here, the order of them. So we say, hey, int ID is equal to 1, string name is equal to nothing. Just string name is just the expected argument. It looks like something got messed up. What happened? String name, int ID 1. So I have a little thing here, and it says optional parameters must appear after all required parameters. Cool. So and whatever you want to call this in our code editor that's providing us some information is letting us know that parameters that are optional, meaning you can omit the ID and it'll just have a default value, are required to be there. They must appear in a specific order. And so what that means is they need to happen after all of the required parameters. So, or sorry, not required parameters, but it is calling it required parameters. So what they're saying is if it's optional, and the reason it's optional is because we have a default value, then it has to come after the required parameters. So required parameters first, any parameter with a default value, thus making it optional, must appear at the end. So then if you had more of these, you just comma separate them. But you can't put them first. Good to know. All right, that's kind of how Python is too, by the way, and probably some other languages and frameworks as well. All right, so in the preceding URL, the one we just did, 3 question mark name Rick, the third URL segment, I've been calling them URL parameters, they're calling it a segment here, matched the route parameter ID. The welcome method contains a parameter ID that matched the URL template in the map controller route method. The trailing question mark starts the query string. So here they're going back to that program.cs file and they're saying, look at this pattern. We have the controller, the action, and then that third segment is that route parameter ID here. And so it matched it. Even though we did an uppercase ID, all caps, it still matched it, okay? So in the preceding example, the third URL segment matched the route parameter ID. The welcome method contains a parameter ID that matched the URL template for the map controller route method. The trailing question mark in the ID question mark indicates that the ID parameter is optional. And we saw that, of course, in that it has a default. All right, cool. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a view, which view is synonymous with like a template, the HTML portion of our website, except that the view is HTML on steroids. It allows us to inject data into it before we actually render it out, send it to the browser. Awesome. So add a view to an ASP.NET Core MVC app. In this article, we're going to add a view, change view and layout pages, change the title, footer, and menu link in the layout file, and then we're going to pass data from the controller to the view. All right, so you're going to modify Hello World controller class to use Razor view files. So Razor, I believe, is just their template engine. If you're coming from Express.js, like any of my older courses or Colts courses, then you're familiar with like EJS, for example. This is the same thing. Cool. So this cleanly encapsulates the process of generating HTML responses to a client. View templates are created using Razor, Razor-based view templates. They have a .cs HTML file extension. They provide an elegant way to create HTML output with C#. Currently, the index method returns a string with a message in the controller class. In the Hello World controller class, replace the index method with the following code. So 2 things are changing. It's no longer returning a string, and it's no longer returning a string. This here being like what it indicates that the method should return, and then the next part being what the method is actually returning. So it's returning this thing called iActionResult, or it expects an iActionResult, and then it returns a instance of invoking this view function here, which I believe is a class. So we want to go to Hello World here. We want to change string to iActionResult, and then we want to return the invocation of view. Okay, you can copy and paste or just update it that way. So this calls the controller's view method. So you can click on here if you want to learn more about the controller's view method. But basically, we get access to view because we have the controller. We get access to the controller because we have MVC. And it just goes up the chain. But there's different instances of using Vue. We're not going to get into them now. You could read the docs, but I think the tutorial is probably going to explain them to us as we go. But this is, if I'm not mistaken, the equivalent of calling like a render in something like Express.js, right? Where you say render, then you pass in a view, the name of the view file, comma, you might pass some context, you have some local variables that you throw in like an object. Okay, so this uses a Vue template to generate an HTML response. Controller methods are referred to as action methods. For example, the index action method in the preceding code generally return an iAction result or a class derived from the action result, not a type like a string. So you can read more about that there if you want to click on that. All right, so for Visual Studio Code, we want to add an index view for Hello World controller, add a new folder named views Hello World, and add a new file to views Hello World folder and name it index.cshtml, and then we're going to paste in this template here. So we're going to jump over here, open up our file explorer. We've been inside controllers over here. We're going to go down to views, and inside of here we have home and shared. So we're going to create a new folder here, and we're going to call it Hello World. And this is part of the namespace thing, in that we want to separate the, like, within Hello World, we'll probably have like an index view and maybe a new view and maybe a show view or a detail view or something like that. And it might be this name the same as the views that are in like the home folder, for example. I mean, sure enough, there's an index view right there. So in order to keep them separated and not have the app get confused about what's what, we group them into folders that are indicative of the controller that this belongs to. So in this case, Hello World is going to be the folder, and then we'll create a new file, and then we'll just call it index.cshtml. So then we'll paste in this code here, and they haven't told us what this does yet, but it looks to me like they have this object called viewData, which has a key called title, which is being set to a default value of a string called index, and then we have an h2, and we have a paragraph, which is some basic HTML. So we'll refresh here and see what they say to do. So they say, hey, go ahead, now that you've added all that, navigate over to your Hello World index, which we know is just at Hello World. And sure enough, there it is. We were getting a string before, but now we're getting index hello from our view template. And then check this out, because of some predefined configuration that they did for us, this template already lives inside of the larger layout that includes the header and the footer. It's pretty sweet. And we're not going to go into it now, but if you wanted to have multiple layouts, you could. You could have a different layout that could have a different header, a different footer, or whatever else you want. But it's nice that they have all this stuff baked in for you. You don't have to think about it. All right, sweet. So the index method in the Hello World controller ran the statement return view, which specified that the method should use a view template file to render a response to the browser. A view template file name wasn't specified, and that was part of the documentation I referred to earlier, essentially saying if you wanted a specific view template, then you would pass it in as a string argument to the view function when you invoke it. But in this case, because we didn't include an argument to view when we called it in that return statement, the MVC framework defaulted to using the default view file, which is the index.cshtml file. So when the view file name isn't specified, the default view is returned. The default view has the same name as the action method, in this case index. So in this example, the view template, views hello world index.cshtml is used. Pretty dope, because if you have another one called like about, another action method inside of the Hello World controller, and you call it about, and then you have a corresponding about.cshtml, you don't have to pass about as a string to your view method. You could literally just say return view, and it'll default to whatever view template has the name, the same matching name as the action method, in this case about in this example. So that's why it mapped index to index. So the following image shows the string hello from our view template hard-coded in the view. Hard-coded meaning this isn't a dynamic value, it's just the thing that we put inside of the H1 or the H2, whatever it was, and the paragraph. Now you can change views and layout pages. So select the menu links, MVC, movie, home, and privacy. Each page shows the same menu layout. The menu layout is implemented in views shared _layout.cshtml file. So if you open that file, the layout template allows specifying the HTML content container layout of a site in one place, applying the HTML container layout across multiple pages in the site. So you'll find the render body line. Render body is a placeholder where all the view specific pages you create show up, wrapped in the layout page. For example, if you select the privacy link, the views home privacy CSHTML view is rendered inside the render body method. So let's go look at that just real quick. We're going to look for the layout, CSHTML, and so that's inside of shared here, which is inside of views. And this has the HTML5 boilerplate. So we've got our doc type up top, we've got our HTML tag, we've got our lang attribute, we've got our head element here that has all of our meta tags and link tags to things like Bootstrap and our custom CSS and whatever custom styles.css, blah, 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 blah. And so then inside here we have our header. This is why we have this same nav bar across the top, and it's got all that stuff there. And then the important part is inside of this container div, we have this @renderBody method that's being invoked. And so what that does is it says, hey, any view template that's using this layout.cshtml, its content will be injected here. So it looks at this one, it takes this content, and it sticks it here. And that's why you get the header and you get the footer and you get all the scripts and the CSS and everything. Pretty cool. All right, so let's head back over to the tutorial. Now we want to change the title, footer, and menu link in the layout file. So we're going to replace the content of our layout file with the following markup, and the changes are highlighted. So we have this thing up here, view data title dash movie app. And what that's going to do is it's going to look at this view data object. It's going to access the title attribute or property, and it's going to give us the corresponding value that's mapped to that key. And it's going to inject it right next to this -movie app thing. And then meanwhile, we're going to have this anchor tag here inside of the nav that says movie app, and it's got some special attributes on there that we'll learn about later. And then down at the bottom, we got this copyright 2023 thing, and we got another anchor tag with some special ASP specific attributes and whatnot. So we're going to copy this whole file. We're going to head back over here and replace the contents of this layout CSS.html file with the contents that were updated. So if you go here, I don't think we're using Git yet. I could be wrong. Let's go ahead and turn this off. They might give you Git by default, in which case maybe we are. Yeah, there's no Git repository. I was going to say we could look at a diff real quick and just show you the difference, but they just showed it to us anyway. So what I was curious about was what it looked like previously, so we could just look at that simply by Command Z and Control C. So interestingly enough, they actually gave us the 2024 thing at the bottom, so that was already there for us, and this was already here at the top for us. I'm curious, this anchor tag. I don't even think we need to do this step. I think the tutorial might be out of date with the default functionality of the framework itself. So it says the preceding markup made the following changes: 3 occurrences of MVC movie to movie app. Okay, so that we probably want to do. Anchor element, MVC movie to movie app. And then it doesn't say what the third thing was, but I think it's just the title. So we do want to make the change because we don't want MVC movie. That's what our app is called, but we actually want to call it movie app. So let's paste this in here. The one thing I did want to change is just change this to 2024. You can do that with JavaScript, by the way, if you ever want to make a dynamic date in the footer. You just figure out what today's date is, the year, and then inject it that way. Anyway, we have a privacy link for our movie app. This is the main change that they're making, is they're changing it from MVC movie to movie app to movie app. So we do need these changes, and we're going to refresh. And now if we go back over here, see up here the title, I haven't refreshed anything yet. It gave me the new one. Movie app up top, movie app right here, still 2024, which is good. And then if you look up at the title here, it says home page. But if we click on, I don't have any links yet for it, but if we go to Hello World, you can see up here, I have to move my camera, index, and then privacy policy. So the title is dynamic now, based on we're about to learn about it. By the way, we are going over on time. I'll stick around for a couple more minutes just to wrap up this section. And when we return next time, we can work on adding a model, working with the database, whatever we can get through in the next hour. Give me some feedback in the comments, either here or on Discord. Let me know if this sort of thing is interesting to you. If you really want to learn more about it, we don't have to continue with it. I think it's pretty cool, just how easy it is to get started with this technology. But also want to make sure that I'm creating content that is appealing to those of you that are willing to stick around and watch it. So, okay, so down here it says in the preceding markup, the ASP area anchor tag helper attribute and attribute value was omitted because this app isn't using areas. And so there's this thing called areas that you can read about. There's a feature used to organize related functionality into a group as a separate namespace for routing, folder structure for views and razor pages. So we're not going to get into that for now, but just know that they took it out because we're not using it. So the movies controller hasn't been implemented. At this point, the movie app link isn't functional. Save the changes and select the privacy link. Notice how the title in the browser, so we already did that, it displays privacy policy, blah, blah, instead of privacy policy MVC movie. So basically we just changed all instances of MVC movie as far as like browser output to movie app. Select the home link, same thing. You'll notice that the title, the anchor text displays the movie app, blah, blah. So if you examine views, view start CS/HTML file, this is super crucial. You'll see that it says layout is equal to _ layout. The views view start CS/HTML file brings in the views shared layout CS/HTML file to each view. The layout property can be used to set a different layout view or set it to null so no layout file will be used. So if you open up your index.html file for your Hello World controller and you change the title and H2 element as highlighted in the following, so here we say title is equal to movie list, and then you put an H2 in here, blah, blah, blah. So let's go ahead and jump over there and do that. So we're going to look up, what do we want? The index for the Hello World. Probably going to end up renaming this stuff, but paste this in. So now we're no longer using index. We're no longer using index up here. We're saying this is our movies list or movie list, and this is my movie list. And then if we refresh, we'll see that change here in a second. Okay, so if we go to / Hello World, we can see my movie list, hello from our view template. And then if you look up at the title up top, it says movie list up there. All right, cool. So the title and H2 element are slightly different, so it's clear which part of the code changes the display. So this line of code here, view data title equals movie list. In this code above, it sets the title property of the view data dictionary. So I've been calling it an object. C# is similar to Python in that they call this data structure a dictionary, which is common in a lot of programming languages. If you're coming from JavaScript, you'll think of these as objects, but dictionaries are just key value pairs. So anyway, the title property is now being set to the value of movie list, which is a string, and it's being used to display inside of the title, what do you want to call it, the title tag in your HTML or title element in your layout page. So that happens here at view data. So that's just accessing the variable that points to the dictionary, and it's extracting using bracket syntax with a string. It's extracting out that property's value for title. So you save it, refresh it, you'll notice everything that we pointed out, it changes in all those different places. So if there are no changes in the browser, it could be cached. So you'll just want to do a Control F5 in the browser to force the response from the server to be loaded. The browser title is created with the view data title we set in the index.html view template, and the additional movie app or -movie app is appended to it. So the content in the index.cs.html view template is merged with the view shared layout HTML view template, like we talked about earlier. A single HTML response is sent to the browser. Layout templates make it easy to make changes that apply across all pages in an app. So to learn more, you can see the layout. So basically, if you want all of your pages or a specific grouping of pages to use a specific layout, so they all have the same footer and they all have the same header, you make the change one time to layout, it's going to apply to all of the different views that are making making use of that layout. So the small bit of quote-unquote data, the hello from our view template message, is hard-coded. So this just means that is something that we wrote in there specifically. It's not actually coming from either the controller or the model. So the MVC application has a view and it has a controller, but it is yet to implement the actual the model. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do when we come back is we're going to learn about passing data from the controller to the view. So go ahead and bookmark this here and stop. Yeah, I'm gonna go. You can stop your debugger, Shift F5 on PC, or just press the little stop button like I just did, and that will close everything, and then you can just close that. So that's it. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the sharing for now. Does anybody have any questions before we get out of here? Thank you all for showing up, hanging out. I'm gonna go ahead and make it to where you can unmute yourself if you have any questions. Also, feel free to use the chat if you're not at a place where you can speak over the microphone. So yeah, we'll open up for questions for a minute or two, and then we'll get on out of here. Thanks, everybody.